So here's 3 issues of Ben Bowie and his Mountain Man. No, it's 5 issues. I got to figure out whether they need Mylar or not.
Hey Randy, I'm here in the hallowed stacks of the Special Collections Library, which you have built, and I know you've seen this a bunch of times, but a lot of people have not. This is the area of stacks upon stacks, rows upon rows, aisles upon aisles of comics that Randy has amassed over the course of his lifetime creating the comics portion of the Special Collections Library. And I just want to tell you, Randy, that it has been one of the sincere highlights of my tenure at Michigan State University to be able to work with you. And I also want to tell you that I'm not the only one who feels this sense of gratitude toward you. So I'd like to introduce you to a few folks.
Well, when I first started working for me, I didn't know what to expect. I never really had hired anybody to work for me before. We had 120 applications for a job, and Randy was the only one that came back. And I said, gee, that's interesting. Okay, let's try him. And it worked out very well. Randy was a good employee. He didn't work for me that long, but he worked hard and worked well and carried that ethic into working for the MSU libraries, and has got a great thing going with the special collections at the university.
When he started, there were very few people in the library world who understood the importance of what at the time was called ephemera. But we all knew in the comic book world, in fandom, that there were collectors who had been collecting comic books since the 1930s when they first began to appear. There were people attempting to catalog books, but only for the purpose of pricing them. But it would be as if all of the books of the world were in the hands of booksellers and not in libraries. And Randy saw that there needed to be a corpus of cataloged and archived and available comic books. And that was his big contribution to both library science and to the world of comic book fandom.
Randy Scott's life's work has had such an impact. When you think about the fact that institutions weren't collecting comic books prior to the 1970s, and the few institutions that did actually collect comic books didn't think it was important to actually catalog them. And so effectively they were invisible, and they were hidden, and they were impossible to discover. And what Randy did is he came in and he said, this material is worthy of being cataloged, and we should spend the time to do it.
Randy and I got to know each other primarily through a fan group called APA-I. And APA is an amateur press association or alliance, depending on how you want to call it out, APA, and I stood for indexing. So APA-I was an indexing group that I belonged to, and so did Randy, and so did many other people, Jerry Bales and Jim Vettabancourt, and there were a lot of us. And we had a little vow that every month we would create an index of some portion of comic book information. In other words, they might be author indexes, they might be bibliographic lists by publisher, they might be attempts to identify artists. And APA-I, we all printed however we wish to, offset printing or mimeograph or ditograph or typing with carbons, whatever. We all printed copies of our indexes, sent them to a central mailer, and then redistributed them back again. And I realized that Randy was serious when Randy began to catalog and index APA-I, because that was meta-cataloging. Most fan projects are only at one level, but he was already one level ahead of us.
Randy developed a plan for that collection as part of an independent study. He told me that today. He did an independent study with Professor Russell Nye, and that independent study amounted to a collection development plan for the comic art collection. So on the basis of what Professor Nye donated, and called attention to, Randy Scott made it into a proper and accessible collection. Randy Scott set a standard for the archiving and librarianship of comic art and comic studies. He literally wrote the book on that.
His book that he published, The Comic Handbook, in 1990 was really groundbreaking, and it explained his process that he had created for how to catalog comic books, because a lot of libraries that had comic books really didn't know the best way to catalog them. And so the book did that, but I think even more importantly, it said to librarians everywhere, comics are something you should be collecting. We need to make this material available to people, and they want to have access to it. They want to have access to it to read, to enjoy, to study, to write about. And his book really basically said to librarians, you should be doing this, and gave people permission to do it.
Well, it's so much part of who he is, every day, all the time. It's hard to sum it up, I guess. It's a big part of Randy's identity, this collection and what he's done.
Randy has the unique position of getting to work in a place that has the best possible smell of any place on earth. It's this beautiful old comic smell that just fills the stacks, and I was so jealous of that ability to spend all that time in this amazing smell cave. If that makes sense.
Hey Randy, guess where I am? I'm at Comic-Con in 2018, and I thought it'd be neat if I just told you how helpful you've been and instrumental in our reprint program from none other place than Comic-Con International. So Randy, the Phantom wouldn't be the Phantom, and Johnny Hazard wouldn't be Johnny Hazard, and of course you also helped us enormously with none other than Milton Caniff's Tearing the Pirates, which George Wonder did. So without your help, we wouldn't have been able to publish those books. They wouldn't have been as great as they are. And comics history would be, well, it just wouldn't be what it is, because we've preserved those things with your help and Michigan State University.
In my last envelope were two items. One, an interview with cartoonist Karen Platt, published in Blaze, the winter 1990 issue, a University of Minnesota newsletter of the university lesbians. The interview has samples of her work and is a sufficient basis for a new vertical file. Second, a clipping from the Metropolitan Area Supplement of New Directions for Women, January-February 1990, which shows a page from a comic book called Night Vision, published by Planned Parenthood of New York. The article has enough information for me to write the organization and ask for a copy of the comic book. Before getting this care package, I had not heard of this cartoonist, nor had I heard of this comic book. I never even heard of either of the publications the clippings are taken from. Still, I have a reputation for having heard of everything connected with comics. Sanford Berman realizes that I can't hear everything by myself and feeds me these things. So I look good. Our collection looks good. Our users are amazed, pleased and well served. And what's it worth to me, to us? Egad, it's priceless.
Now, the story that I want to share is actually not my own exactly, but rather the story of my mom, who happens to work over in communication arts and sciences at Michigan State. Michigan State is also my alma mater, but I am no longer there. I haven't lived in Michigan in quite some time. So when I began working on a project 2 years ago involving some questions about LGBTQ representation in Marvel Comics in the 1980s, I realized that there were two different texts that were in the special collections at Michigan State that I really needed access to: a couple of interviews with Jim Shooter and also some writings by Andy Mangels. And so I did what any good son would do and asked my mom to go to the special collections and take copies of those comics for me so that I could have those photos and work from that material remotely down here in the South. Well, my mom is not a comic studies expert, and she has not done any of that type of work before, but she loves me dearly and went to the library to try and check out these comics. And when Randy realized and saw what the requests were, he apparently came upstairs to figure out who it was that was looking for this material. He wanted to talk to them and get a sense of what their project was. And instead he ran into my mom, who was confused and struggling and not really sure what it was that she was trying to find for me. What I think is remarkable, though, is that he actually then sat down with my mom, helped her work through and locate the interviews and the materials that I needed in those two particular comics, and then gave her his contact information to pass along to me, and was incredibly helpful so that she could get that information for me. And I think it's remarkable when you think about Randy and the work that he does, that he, first of all, saw a request and wanted to come up and meet the person making the request. But then also when he realized that that person wasn't actually doing comic studies and had no idea what she was looking for, that she was doing it for her son who lived hundreds of miles away, he still came up and worked through and walked through all of that with her. And I think it speaks obviously to his love of the kind of work that he does and the kind of service he provides to a number of different communities, but also I think to the love that he has for comics in general, and the kind of work that he has put into building a collection that can be useful and used by so many scholars and so many fans in different communities and students across the country.
Well, I have to say that, first of all, I've heard about this special collection since the 1980s and have wanted to see it ever since then. I have friends who have come here and seen it and spoken very highly both of the collection and of Randy Scott, the curator of this collection. Like, this is his personal collection, right? It's staggering. It's magnificent. It's an incredible resource. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to come out to MSU and do the Comics Forum, was because I wanted to see this fantastic array of comics and books about comics.
It's an indispensable resource, and there's nothing else like it.
I have to say it was a delight a few years ago, 5 years ago now, can you believe that, in 2013, when you came out here to Singapore and Lynn was with you for a few days and collecting comics both here, and then you went on to Australia, and I could extend some of the hospitality that you'd extended to me. I could return that by having you stay here. One story I remember from that time is I got up early one morning, about 6:30, 7:15, and wandered out, and there you were sitting at my dining room table cataloging comics at Michigan State University online. And that just, to me, sums up your love of your job, the way that you've been dedicated to it, that it's your life that's intermeshed with that, and it's given you happiness and pleasure. And I'm sure, like all of us, some days where you've been not exactly the most happy person in the world. But to see you so engaged with what you do over all these years just reminds me that if we find something we love doing, it's a lot easier to keep doing it and doing it
It's been almost 11 years now since I first came to Michigan State and the US to be your intern at the Comic Art Collection. I would say it changed my life. I returned many times as a researcher, always profiting from your kind hospitality and deep knowledge in all things comics. You and your wife Lynn have become my American family. I'm looking forward to my next visit with you, to meet you there, and hopefully not only doing research but enjoying the time.
I was so incredibly impressed by the care and the fanaticism that Randy was showing to this incredible collection of comics, and how he was able to express that love through his tour. And very honored that he mentioned that I also have a number down there for my own work.
Well, I think it's really amazing, and you know, it's possible that I don't always seem like I appreciate it. That can happen, but I do appreciate it, and I'm always so impressed with what he's accomplished and with his single-mindedness and his commitment. I think it's rare in a person actually to have that level of, for so many years, that level of single-minded commitment to a big project. And I admire that a lot, I really do.
No one else was doing that kind of work when he undertook to do it. So he blazed a trail as a bibliographer, as an archivist, as a scholar. So I think he built something very grand.
And I was lucky enough to meet Randy when I was asked to MSU by the Graphic Narrative Network and to do work in the exquisite archive that he has put together. And I was lucky enough to be with a number of really wonderful, warm, friendly, and brilliant scholars. And I was lucky enough also to work with the materials that he's collected, which comprised the most astonishing collection I think that we actually have in the world. So I want to thank Randy for all of the work that he's put in for this amazing resource that's going to be so important for all of us for generations to come.
Well, I'm proud and privileged to have known and collaborated with Randy. He's a hell of a guy.
I think that half of the long shelf in my office devoted to the ever-growing body of comic studies research, half that shelf would be empty without the resources in the MSU archive. Without it, I'm not sure that there'd be a comic studies or the other institutions that the institutions that exist to serve comic studies. It would certainly be a lot less robust and less historically grounded. So I'm incredibly grateful to be there. I get a lump in my throat just thinking about the significance of that.
Gosh, yes, the significance of it is overwhelming.
Randy, thank you very much from everybody at Hermes Press and everybody in the comic strip and comic book world.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Randy.
Auf Wiedersehen, alles Gute, dein Matthias.
Thank you, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Randy, thank you for your unending dedication to the field of comic studies.
So, these five will get Mylars, and I take out a spacer because they'll need the spacer to buttons. So in this case, I get to pull out an incomplete copy and replace it with a much nicer copy. Good deal. One of the great joys of working in these old things is replacing bad copies with good copies, but the greatest joy is finishing a run. accomplished, that's accomplished. That's what we do.